About this time, China, Mao got together a group of young people called the Red Guard. All right. Now, folks, again, these Red Guardsmen may not mean a lot to you. On a personal note, we had to subscribe to U.S. News and Report when I was a senior. It was part of our required course called Senior Social Studies, otherwise called Civics. And every senior was required to take it. So, and we had to subscribe to U.S. News and Report. And the U.S. News and World Report would sometimes feature articles about the Red Guard. Here's what was so interesting. Well, I'm about to get into what they did. The Red Guardsmen made up of people, boys and girls, my age. In other words, communism took over China the year I was born, 1949. Well, these Red Guardsmen and women, again, were my age, and they went through China and killed everybody they didn't like. They killed a lot of their teachers who had corrected them several times and corrected perhaps their grammar or given them low marks in school. They killed their rich neighbors, but they wound up creating a whole lot of lawlessness and chaos. Now, Mao had started them off. He said he wanted these young people to be thoroughly indoctrinated. And every one of the Red Guardsmen and women had little books called the Little Red Book, which had been printed up by Mao, which was like considered their Bible. You know, this is your communist life, by which the rule book by which you live by. And they went around destroying. Now, to this day, the Chinese call these people the waste generation. And a time when they should have been learning a trade. You know, there was a time when I was thinking about going to college, learning to be a teacher, among other things, but then other people were learning to be engineers. I mean, my classmates, some of them learned to be mechanics, and some became nothing more than factory workers, but all of us eventually found jobs. And some of my female classmates became homemakers, yes. But these Red Guards were going around destroying. They did not learn a trade. And today they're a generation gap that the Chinese call the waste generation, the generation that did not produce anything, totally unproductive. Now, your book talks about how that some of the Red Guardsmen became disillusioned. For instance, one young man joined the Red Guard, and he thought, hey, well, he was just all enthused about it. I'm going to amount to something. I'm going to do something. I want to make this country great. Next thing you knew, though, he had to watch while his younger sister, in effect, really shoot out her mother while she joined the Red Guard, denounced her mother. You might almost say cussed her mother, and went off, and he just said, I like my mother, I don't like this. Then next thing, there was some other groups of Red Guard were coming into his home. They noticed his father had 3 neckties as a Western shirt, so they beat his father severely, and all he could do was look on. Then they stole a bunch of his father's stuff, and then they took his own transistor radio. Now that may not sound like a lot to you, but in those days for a Chinese young man to own a transistor radio was like us today owning an iPad or a laptop computer. I mean, it was a valuable tool, so they had to watch as they took that away. And after a while, he became disillusioned with the Red Guard. Again, a group of young people found that, they were determined to undo everything that had been done to take away all religion. You know, basically, they said, let's take away every reference to Confucius, every reference to Buddha, every reference to Christ, all types of religious expression, and we're going to delete from China everything that is old and make China red and make it new. In fact, they went so far in their attempts to make China red that they decided, hey, we don't want red lights to be stoplights. Let's make red lights go lights, because after all, the color red is a sacred color among communists. So instead of making a red light stop, well, what they did, they found themselves at odds with the whole world, because universally the whole world stops at a red light and goes when the light is green. Well, even their own people, they wound up colliding into each other in their automobiles because they got confused. I thought red meant stop, and here they'd stop, and when really green meant stop in China. And then foreigners who were allowed to come in, they did allow foreigners, they got confused also. They had numerous accidents and numerous fatalities. And they finally said, we got to join the rest of the human race. And red lights became stoplights once again. But for a while, they tried to undo the color red as being the color of stopping. Mao himself had to concede that a whole lot of the people who had been victims of the Red Guard were innocent of any crime. They just simply, the Red Guard was a bunch of young people who got out of control. Well, Mao died of Lou Gehrig's disease. And even in the United States, there was no treatment at that time and no cure. Today, we know very little more about Lou Gehrig's disease than we did then. We can prolong a few lives just for a little bit of time, but if any of you are familiar with it, Lou Gehrig's disease is a paralysis that slowly takes away a person's ability to move. There is a power struggle that the communist world has never been able to get a system going where they can decide who's to take over when the party leader dies. So when the party leader dies, there's a power struggle. And during the power struggle, Deng Xiaoping wound up taking over. Now the name is not pronounced the way it's spelled, but anyway, it is. Deng Xiaoping was to rule from 1976 to 1997. And one of his first acts was to put Mao's wife and three other persons on trial, called the trial of the Gang of Four. What they wanted to do is lay all the blame for all the problems China had on Mao's wife and her three, you might say, persons who were complicit. Basically, used them as a scapegoat. Now, any of you know anything about a scapegoat in ancient Jewish theology? When they needed to get forgiveness for their sin, they laid all the blame for all their sins on a scapegoat, and then they banished the scapegoat from the camp. I mean, we realized that all of us sometimes need to deal with issues that we are not proud of, things we've done we don't ever wish we hadn't done. Well, the Chinese needed a scapegoat, so they used Mrs. Mao and three other persons as a scapegoat. They put them on trial, gave some of them long prison sentences, others they executed, in hopes that this would expunge them of all the crimes that had been committed against the Chinese. I mean, we do the same thing. I mean, it's only been a week ago, folk, or less, that our administration used some woman as a scapegoat and kicked her out of her office because of the failure of the health care reform. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, but just lay all the blame for all the wrong on this woman. Then she gets banished from the camp, and the rest of the camp then goes free. It was all her fault. Nixon tried the same thing when he tried to use John Dean as a scapegoat. The problem was John Dean was not a willing scapegoat. All right, anyway, and in this case, I can't say that it really worked anyway. Now, however, under Deng Xiaoping, China began to retreat from pure communism and began to change a little bit, and they began to industrialize. Mao wanted them to industrialize, but somehow these farming people just could not industrialize, and here was a problem. In order to industrialize, you need some people whom you allow to forge ahead. They're called entrepreneurs, enterprising people who have the ability to lead, the ability to command lead, and allow these people to forge ahead. Folk have heard there's a certain species of crab in Latin America. If you put one of them in a bucket, he can easily crawl out. But the natives, they don't put lids on a bucket. They put several of them in a bucket, and none of them get out. Because when one starts to get out, the rest of them pull him down. And if another one starts to get out, the rest of them pull him down. And they spend all their time pulling each other down. Basically, that's what happened to China under Deng Xiaoping. I mean, under Mao Zedong. Now, under Deng Xiaoping, he did get some industry started, and China began the process of industrialization. And today, yes, there are a lot of industries in China. In 1989, a really ugly incident occurred at Tiananmen Square. And Tiananmen Square, a bunch of young people, this time these were the next generation after the Red Guardsmen. These were college-age students. Some of them may have been high school age. They met at Tiananmen. If you know anything about China, Tiananmen Square is located in Beijing, and it's like the most public place in China. It's extremely crowded. I mean, China is the most populous country in the world, and Beijing is its capital, and Tiananmen Square is the central, like, part of the capital city. But they took over Tiananmen Square and they began to demand more democracy, more rights. What's that? I'm looking at page 808 now. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit hard. What's the question? No, the young people temporarily took over. They were college-age students got together, and they met by the hundreds of thousands at Tiananmen Square, and it got worldwide attention. And they began to demand more democracy, more say-so, more freedoms, and better economic conditions. The Chinese listened to them for a while, and then when troops from China would not move in on their own sons, you might say, Deng Xiaoping called in troops from Inner Mongolia, Inner Mongolians who were far away and not related to the people, and they fired bullets and basically dispersed the crowd at Tiananmen Square, and a bunch of leaders were executed. Now, the way the Chinese executed their young people, they would shoot them in the head, dead, and then send a bill for 19 cents that cost the bullet to the parents and say, this was what we had to use to kill your child. You owe us 19 cents. This actually occurred. And this showed the whole world that communism has never been and still is not able to tolerate dissent. Both the ability to tolerate dissent is one of the greatest freedoms you can have. It helps to guarantee productivity and innovation, invention. When you can't tolerate dissent, you're fairly guaranteed to be stagnant. Anyway, Tiananmen Square appeared to be a failure. And immediately after the incident at Tiananmen Square, the government issued new guidelines, said that Marxist, Leninist, communists had to be taught in the schools, and wanted every young person thoroughly indoctrinated in the ideals of Marx and Lenin to make sure that something like that didn't happen again. But as communism began to fail, they began to return to Confucius. So a book talks about the return to Confucius, or did they decide to go back to Confucius? You have to notice, Confucianism became the dominant religion in 3 places in the world: the northern part of Korea, which is the part closest to China, Vietnam, and China, and all 3 of those went communist. And your book asks the question, did Confucius, without him knowing it and without him meaning to, did he set up a teaching that led to communism, or that was going to lead to 2,300 years later, was going to lead to the Chinese people going under communism? Confucius taught, among other things, that you should obey the central authority. Communism taught that you should obey the central authority. And again, were the Chinese being set up for a communistic takeover? And were the Vietnamese being set up for the same thing? In Southeast Asia, except for Vietnam, most of Southeast Asia became Buddhist, and Buddhists have not easily gone communistic. Muslims almost never become communist. But Confucius and his followers seemingly just embraced communism and held on to it. And they've held on to communism even more than 23 years after Russia seemingly to abandon it. Anyway, Confucianism began to make a comeback, and other religions began to be allowed in, including Christianity was allowed in. I'm going to say a little more about that. Taoism and Buddhism. Well, there are four main religions: Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Now, I want to elaborate on Christianity. It is well known that during the time that Mao ruled China, Christians were severely persecuted, forced into camps and beaten. And a lot of them were taken from their families and scattered in hopes that the Christianity would die out, but this actually proved to be counterproductive, because as the Christians were scattered, they were able to spread their message to even more and more people. And if you talk to a Chinese person today, he'll tell you, oh, we once persecuted Christians, we don't do that anymore. There are rumors going around that it's still done. That it's done, they're more secretive about it. But there are rumors that Christians are still forced to work in work camps. But officially, the Chinese have allowed it. Again, it's difficult to know what the exact truth is. Now, in the course of reading your papers, I don't know if it was this class, but one of you wrote a paper where that communism made China into a superpower. Now, it is true the communists took over China, and it is true that today China is considered one of the world's two superpowers. But what the paper left out was one little factoid in between, that China became a superpower after they mellowed down on their communistic stance and began to allow other forms of thought in. Only then did China begin to advance and achieve somewhat of superpower status. They began to industrialize, and today I would have to call them a great nation. They become great fairly rapidly. They have problems with their greatness, though. And one of their big problems, I mean, I'll say this, my wife and both my daughters made visited China, two separate parts of China on two separate trips. And you may have heard this, you cannot breathe the air in China. A lot of the Chinese are forced to wear masks. And even worse than that, it's now been determined that 10% of the pollution that you find in California originated in China. It's not the people of California generating pollution. Why is China so polluted? Simply this: they have a whole lot of people crowded in. Whereas in our country, we have a big population center in the Northeast. We have a big population center around Los Angeles and San Diego. We have another big population center right here in Metro Atlanta. Our population centers are scattered, widely scattered. In China, their population center is mostly in a small part of the country called China proper, with a bunch more people living in Manchuria, and the rest of China is vast, vast open countryside, a lot of it uninhabitable. So they have a whole lot of people crowded together, but also they don't have our pollution control devices. Now, 60 years ago, if you'd have walked down the city of Atlanta, you'd have been difficulty breathing. The cars are putting out a whole lot of smoke, and you couldn't help but smell the fumes. Today, there are about 10 or 20 times more cars in Atlanta than there were 60 years ago. And the air is cleaner. Think of that next time you have to pay money to have your emissions checked. I had a person who used to sit next to me at Lockheed. I don't like it. I said, I like it because I went to Mexico once and I went to Jamaica once. And in both countries, you can hardly breathe the air in big cities. And they have about 10% of the cars that we have. And of course, the year I went to Jamaica was 1973. And again, you go to Kingston, you could smell the pollution. Go to Montego Bay, again, the same thing. And go to Mexico City, oh, it was really bad. That was 1976. Now, they might have cleaned it up since then. But go to an American city, unless you go to a place like Los Angeles or Chattanooga, the air is at least breathable. You can breathe without mask. In China, the air is hardly breathable. And again, nobody knows what is going to be the solution to the problem. And some of their pollution is coming all the way across the Pacific Ocean and hitting our own country.